Gay people have had a rough time in the United States. While there have been advances in their rights and standing in society, from finally having same-sex marriage legally recognized up to a recent presidential campaign by an openly gay man, this has only come after a long, sad history filled with discrimination, violence, and stereotyping. Lots and lots of stereotyping. 1981's Zorro the Gay Blade doesn't exactly do a lot to dispel those stereotypes. George Hamilton plays a dual role as the sons of the original Zorro, the famous masked vigilante who fought for justice in pre-United States Los Angeles of the early 1800s. Hamilton enjoyed a surge in popularity after the success of his Dracula parody, Love at First Bite, that lasted all the way up to his following film, Zorro the Gay Blade. After that, it was pretty much back to supporting roles in television for the actor. The film begins with a black and white pre-credit sequence reminiscent of old movie serials. Narrated by the legendary voice actor Frank Welker, this serves as a quick refresher to establish the Zorro character as an outlaw who fights oppression and one who leaves his calling card of the letter Z carved into the clothing of his victims. After the credits, a title card explains the film is set 50 years after Zorro, but this is a very poor explanation. One would think this means a half-century after his death, but as we'll see, it really means 50 years after the masked vigilante was active. We're introduced to the film's principal protagonist, Don Diego Vega, at his home in Madrid and in bed with a woman, quickly establishing his Latin heterosexuality.
Then why doesn't my husband ever say that?
Because he's not intelligent. He is not intuitive. He is not insightful.
And he is not in Barcelona.
They're interrupted by her husband, who is understandably upset and attacks the lovers, but is quickly defeated by the younger and much better fighter. This victory is short-lived, however, as the husband's brothers arrive to aid him. Don Diego's own reinforcement arrives as well, his mute manservant Paco. Paco is played by Donovan Scott, who is probably best known as Leslie Barbara from the original Police Academy movie. In the first of one of the film's many recurring jokes, using mime, Paco reads a letter to Don Diego from his father, ordering his son to return to him in California. Don Diego immediately quits fighting and leaps to an awaiting carriage below his bedroom, but not before giving his sword to the woman and, presumably, leaving her to the mercy of her violent husband, who just moments before tried to kill both of them. Ladies and gentlemen, the film's hero. Don Diego and Paco arrive at his birthplace, Los Angeles, California, which at this point is still under Mexican rule. Expecting to be greeted by his father, instead Don Diego is met by his childhood friend Esteban, now captain of the guard, and his wife Florinda, for whose affections the two once competed as boys. Their marriage is not a happy one, and the strife between them is another running joke throughout the film. Esteban is brilliantly and bombastically played by the late Ron Liebman, whose last role before dying in 2019 was Ron Cadillac on Archer. Florinda is played by Brenda Vaccaro, an actress with a long career but known by many of us cartoon aficionados as the voice of Johnny Bravo's mother, Bunny. This is not the last time that name will appear in this video. Esteban sadly informs Don Diego that his father had recently died in a horse riding accident.
He was out riding when his horse was frightened by a turtle.
Una tortuga.
See? The horse reared, your father was thrown, and died soon after.
He further explains that upon the death of Don Diego's father, Esteban assumed the late man's duty as alcalde, the leader of the territory, until the landowners elect a permanent replacement. Saddened, Don Diego leaves for his ancestral home.
My friend, I want you to know that the turtle who caused this has been executed. It's been very nice talking to you.
The scene ends with Florinda berating Esteban with this bit of dialogue.
Don't you think he knows that's not the truth about a turtle? Oh!
Don't you think he knows that's not the truth about the turtle? This line could be taken one of two ways. Either Florinda is mocking Esteban for lying about having had the turtle who caused the tragedy executed, or, and this is much more foreboding, the riding accident that killed Don Diego's father wasn't caused by a turtle at all, implying that Esteban may have been involved in the death with Florinda's full knowledge. Considering Esteban's immediate tyrannical rule, that's a valid theory, but would unfortunately color the character as much more sinister than comical. Yes, he's a brutal dictator, but with the exception of a handful of torture scenes played for laughs, all of Esteban's atrocities occur off camera or are merely alluded to. We never see him as anything more than cartoonishly evil, like the King and the Wizard of Id comic strip, so I choose to believe he was innocent of killing his childhood friend's father. After Esteban is elected as alcalde by the landowners, his acceptance speech is interrupted by Charlotte Taylor Wilson, played by model and actress Lauren Hutton. Charlotte is a political activist from New England who is there to foment a revolution against the wealthy landowners who she refers to as the greedy bloodsuckers. Don Diego is immediately smitten and introduces himself.
Don Diego Vega. I'm with the greedy bloodsuckers.
She, however, is more interested in the plight of the peasants than his Latin charm. With Charlotte's introduction, we get another of the film's running jokes: Don Diego's thick accent.
And you smell it. Bisati perfumes, not that ship oil.
Ship oil? You mean the oil from boats?
No, ship oil from the ships in the field.
What ships in the field?
You have never heard of the ships in the field? The little, bababas?
Later that night, Don Diego's elderly housekeeper delivers his late father's fencing dummy and an invitation to a masked ball Esteban is holding to celebrate his election. While Don Diego ruminates on his costume choices, the housekeeper casually mentions the dummy was related to Don Diego's destiny, which immediately piques his interest. Opening it, he discovers his father had been the masked vigilante Zorro, and further, upon his death, bequeathed the mantle of the hero to whichever one of his two sons read the late man's letter of explanation. Don Diego decides to wear the costume to that night's ball, while Paco dresses up as what he thinks is a fierce bear.
Don't be silly. Bears don't have ears like that. I will allow you that you are a pig, but that is as far as I will go, that's all.
Poor Paco. On the way to the celebration, the two meet a peasant who just had his money taken by what Don Diego assumes is a bandit, against whom he immediately gives chase and defeats.
I beg your mercy from your flashing blade and oh my God! And from your head, hideous dog!
Poor Paco. Don Diego allows the man to escape to spread the word that Zorro is back. He returns to the old peasant with all his original money as well as that of the bandit, and only then learns that the man had not been a bandit, but was rather the alcalde's hated tax collector Velasquez. Nonplussed that he had just attacked the government official, Don Diego nevertheless revels in the old man's gratitude, particularly after the peasant finally realizes the significance of the costumed adventurer in front of him.
Zorro! Oh, Zorro!
That is a little more like it.
Incidentally, the old peasant here is played by Clive Reville, the original voice of the Emperor in The Empire Strikes Back before George Lucas, George Lucas the scene. Reville was also the original voice of Alfred in Batman the Animated Series before being replaced by Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. I'm pretty sure George Lucas didn't have anything to do with that. Arriving at the ball, Don Diego finds Charlotte outside being threatened with arrest by the alcalde's men, but he intervenes and escorts her to the ball.
There is your invitation, Senor Beaver.
Poor Paco. Once inside, Don Diego introduces Charlotte to Florinda.
Senora, may I present Senorita Charlotte Taylor Wilson?
People's Independence Committee. Here, read all about how to fight against the tyrants and tyrantitas. Thank you.
Florinda orders Charlotte to be taken away and properly outfitted for the ball before clinging to the handsome Don Diego without really knowing who he is. Esteban, meanwhile, is told of the tax robbery by Velasquez, who didn't quite catch the name of the man who robbed him.
He said his name was, Zorro.
Velasquez soon identifies Zorro as the person dancing with Esteban's wife, and the alcalde immediately challenges the masked man to a duel, in which he is promptly humiliated. Making his escape in the most swashbuckling way imaginable, Don Diego basks in the accolades of the peasants gathered outside, only to break his foot on the jump from the balcony. Esteban and Velasquez see the injury and realize it will be easy to identify the masked man now. Back at his villa, Don Diego ponders his broken foot before being visited by a very horny Florinda who tells him all about Zorro's appearance at the ball. He rebuffs her advances until the arrival of Esteban, who comes seeking Don Diego's advice. After hiding Florinda in his father's fencing dummy, Don Diego greets the disconsolate Esteban and feigns surprise at the news of Zorro's return. Esteban, though, suddenly realizes that Don Diego could be Zorro, especially since he didn't see his old friend at the ball. Doing his best to hide the pain of his broken foot, Don Diego dances with Esteban to prove his innocence, which the inept alcalde accepts. After stabbing the fencing dummy in his anger, Esteban promises a reign of terror and takes his leave. Don Diego tentatively checks on Florinda and is relieved to see she was uninjured.
Florinda, you're no hurt.
Thank God for small favors! Don't touch me!
Several weeks later, a still crippled Don Diego bemoans Esteban's brutality and his own inability to fulfill his destiny by fighting the injustice. He and Paco are soon surprised by the arrival of Don Diego's twin brother Ramon, who is on leave from the British Navy. No longer the Latin heartthrob Don Diego remembered, Ramon is now a foppish gay man who calls himself Bunny Wigglesworth, explaining away his change as the influence of the Navy.
They say the Navy makes men. Well, I'm living proof they made me.
Don Diego informs his brother of their father's death as well as their shared legacy of Zorro, urging his twin to assume the role while he recovers. Bunny is reluctant at first, but agrees, provided he can make what he considers some necessary changes to that drab little costume.
But I'm afraid this costume's not to my taste. If I am going to be this Zorro chappie, I want to make more of a statement. I want the world to recognize Zorro the Gay Blade.
He said it! He said it!
The next scene finds Velasquez squeezing pesos out of the poor peasants before he is accosted by Zorro. But this time, instead of wearing black and wielding a sword, the hero arrives dressed entirely in plum and cracking a whip. Velasquez reports the outlaw's theft and new appearance and mannerisms to Esteban.
He sounded like a...
This is followed by the rest of the landowners arriving to tell of their own robberies by the masked man, who wore a different costume at each occurrence.
Aha! 2 fruits and now a vegetable.
Actually, the avocado is a fruit, Excellency. No, you're right. 2 fruits, 1 vegetable.
True story. This scene is why I always remember that avocados are fruits and not vegetables. Meanwhile, the new Zorro visits Charlotte and gives her some of the stolen pesos for her work. She confesses her love for him, but Bunny is obviously not interested. He returns to Don Diego and playfully tells him all about her confession, which depresses the injured man who still pines for the political activist. Before Bunny can explain further, he is forced to make a quick exit as they are interrupted by Esteban seeking counsel. Showing Don Diego a new wanted poster for Zorro, Esteban again suspects his childhood friend.
Say something like a sissy boy.
Something like a sissy boy.
You know what I mean.
Leave!
Esteban again apologizes, before glancing toward the window and seeing a fleeing man dressed in orange. He gives pursuit, followed by his limping friend. Thinking quickly, Don Diego explains that Bunny is merely a traveling priest staying the night at the villa. Accepting this lie, Esteban asks for a blessing from the priest, who obliges before taking off with the alcalde's horse and money pouch. Desperate to catch Zorro, Esteban hatches a scheme to hold another masked ball to showcase his wife's expensive new necklace, knowing the opportunity to steal it would flesh out the hero. Outwitting the alcalde again, Zorro arranges beforehand that all men attending the ball would be dressed as the outlaw himself. Don Diego escorts Bunny, who is dressed in drag and pretending to be his female cousin, Margarita Wigglesworth from Santa Barbara. Esteban is immediately smitten by Bunny and spends the rest of the evening enjoying her company until she spills a drink on Florinda.
You clumsy cow! Look what you've done!
Following the enraged woman into the ladies' room to help clean her off, Bunny steals the necklace and leaves a cheeky calling card on the bathroom mirror. Okay, the elephant in the room here is how can Esteban be so stupid as to not recognize Don Diego as Zorro, or at least working with the outlaw, when he so obviously is? Especially now where we have not one, but two instances of Bunny tricking the alcalde while either staying at Don Diego's villa or being escorted by him to the ball. It's the old, how can Superman fool people with a simple pair of glasses bit, but I don't remember reading any comic books with Superman forcing Jimmy Olsen to dress up as a woman and taking him as a +1 to Lex Luthor's debutante ball. Although considering how insane Golden and Silver Age comics were, I wouldn't exactly be surprised to learn that was an actual story in one of them. His brother now fully recovered and ready to reassume Zorro's duties, Bunny returns to his ship, but not before giving the stolen necklace to Don Diego and suggesting he give it to Charlotte. Don Diego laments that the woman is in love with Bunny, but the latter disagrees.
Nah, Zorro she loves.
Don Diego returns to Charlotte to give her the stolen necklace and confess his feelings. She says she knew Don Diego was Zorro from the start, officially making her the smartest person in the film. The moment is interrupted by soldiers and Don Diego flees, but unfortunately for the two lovers, their tryst is seen by a treacherous peasant who reports it to Esteban. Once again, Esteban schemes to flush out Zorro, this time by holding a public execution of Charlotte. He finally succeeds as Zorro, again dressed as a priest, holds him at knife point. You know, by now you'd think that Esteban would know not to trust anyone in the clergy. To stop the execution, Don Diego agrees to take Charlotte's place in front of the firing squad.
You're the bravest man I have ever met.
I'm impressed with myself, too.
He is saved, however, by the arrival of Bunny, also dressed as Zorro, in what I consider the best moment of the film, and a line I still quote verbatim to this day.
2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a peso. All for Zorro! Stand up and say so!
Inspired, the peasants erupt in revolution and overpower Esteban and his men, who also turn against the alcalde. Defeated, Esteban's final moment of ignominy is his wife leaving him.
At least I know you will not desert me. See?
Well, I'm glad to see you're finally developing a sense of humor, Esteban. Excuse me.
Wait, you can be the wife of a hated dictator and just walk away after he's deposed? Somebody should have told Elena Ceausescu that. With Esteban defeated and the revolution a success, Bunny exits for good this time, leaving Don Diego and Charlotte behind to discuss their future. Despite her being independently wealthy and a strong political activist who spent most of the film putting aside her own needs for the people, this is still a 1980s film, so of course Charlotte decides to settle down to be a wife and mother. The two ride off, and the film ends with a spirited final attempt to kill any good feelings the audience might have had from the preceding 90 minutes with this terrible pun. Growing up, my mother and I loved Zorro the Gay Blade and would often quote it. In fact, it had probably been at least 10 years since the last time I'd seen this film before watching it for this video, and I still remembered almost all of the dialogue. But obviously, it's not a film that aged well considering all the stereotypes. I'm not gay, and therefore have no real right to ascertain whether or not Zorro the Gay Blade is offensive or does any harm to the gay community. I will say though, it feels like a film written by a heterosexual man with no animosity towards gay people. I would even argue that for a film released in 1981, Zorro the Gay Blade was surprisingly progressive for its time. Look at this scene from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, released 8 years after Zorro the Gay Blade.
Ted, you're alive! Yeah! I fell out of my suit when I hit the floor.
A gay slur is used as a punchline by these otherwise utterly likable dudes. 2 years later, it appears again in the sequel.
Dudes, even though you're doing this, we love you. We love you. Catch you later, Bill and Ted!
Or this sequence in 1994's Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, after the titular hero realizes he had unwittingly slept with a man. Contrast those scenes with how the heterosexual characters in Zorro the Gay Blade act toward the extremely campy bunny. While the words poof, sissy boy, and fruitcake are indeed used, they're hardly as problematic as the slur uttered by Bill and Ted. When seeing his brother for the first time since they were children, Don Diego immediately accepted him for who he was now.
Ramon, Bunny.
The alcalde and his men recognized that the new Zorro was different, but didn't focus on that difference, instead concentrating on his crimes and not what they could have considered his degeneracy. Charlotte was even attracted to how confident and carefree Bunny was as his alter ego. The only time in the film where Don Diego even hints at gay panic is during the second masked ball when Esteban is clearly romantically interested in Bunny. But even this is ambiguous. While the expression on his face could be interpreted as being disturbed by the flirting going on between what he knows is two men, it is equally as plausible that Don Diego is both amazed that this obvious deception is working so well, and what the ramifications would be if Esteban realized what was really going on. Speaking of which, even when Esteban, the film's main villain, learned Margarita Wigglesworth was really a man, he seemed more wistful than angry at being fooled, and you can see real regret here as he tosses the flower out the window. It's probably safe to say that if Zorro the Gay Blade had been made today or even in the mid to late 1990s, the majority of the conflict in the film would have focused on Bunny's sexuality rather than his effectiveness as a hero. Speaking of which, let's compare the film's two principal protagonists, Don Diego and Bunny. Don Diego is the ultimate Latin lover. He's macho, witty, handsome, and charming. Bunny is a stereotypical gay man, posh, foppish, and effeminate. Don Diego fights with a manly sword, while Bunny is reduced to brandishing a bullwhip as an obvious allusion to the sadomasochism that ignorant heterosexuals believe is indicative of the gay lifestyle. Yet as Zorro, Bunny was the much more successful of the two. Don Diego had a single day as Zorro, which started with him inadvertently attacking a tax collector instead of a bandit and getting knocked from his horse by the same tree branch along with the villain. Later at the masked ball, after a successful swashbuckle, he ended his first evening as Zorro by breaking his foot, not only making him unable to help the peasants who were suffering because of the alcalde's anger at Zorro, but also putting himself in a dangerous position of being easily outed as the outlaw. Bunny, meanwhile, was successful every time he donned the costume. He repeatedly robbed tax collectors and drove the landowners and Esteban into a massive panic. And not a gay panic. He fooled the alcalde and escaped his clutches not once but twice, successfully stole the necklace from the dictator's wife, and finally rescued his brother from a firing squad while simultaneously igniting a successful revolution. In the end, Zorro the Gay Blade is not much more than a live-action Looney Tunes cartoon, complete with a character named Bunny dressing in drag to fool a loud and violent mustachioed villain. I would absolutely recommend watching this film, but unfortunately at this time it's difficult to find legitimately. It's not on Netflix or the other usual streaming services, and the DVD is out of print, meaning you'll likely have to search eBay for an affordable copy. Again, as a straight man, my opinion has little merit as to the suitability of the Bunny Wigglesworth Zorro as a homosexual action hero. However, it's also difficult to watch this film and expect anyone to get that upset over it. Its offensiveness is, paradoxically, almost entirely inoffensive and should be watched not only as a relic of its time, but as a precursor to how gay people would start to be seen as acceptable in television and film and not simply a stereotype to laugh at.
Well, actually, I'm not all that bad with the whip.
I'm so sorry. Zorro! No, no, I'm not gonna do that. No.